learning a minority language in a dominant language context, so English being the dominant language in this case. So all are welcome, and I see a lot of our friends from different parts of the world, which is one of the most wonderful things about MLF. And just know that the primary focus of this session will be the North American context, the English-speaking context, but all are welcome. So I'm sure something can be learned from Chantal. So I would like to first thank, and I know she signed up, I don't know if she's here, but I would like to thank Kathy Fleener by way of Katrine Cohen from Portland, French American School in Portland, for the connection with Chantal. They brought her in Portland to do a session with parents, and they passed her name on to us. So thankful for the connection. We always work as a team like that in MLF Network, and so I'm very appreciative of that. So I would like us to welcome Chantal Mayer-Crittenden. Had to practice that a little bit. And she is joining us. Her research, she'll give a little more background about herself, but her research is in just this, the minority language and the dominant context. So she's going to share some of the research insights with us, as well as some practical applications, particularly for the context that we find ourselves in now, remote teaching and learning. So she has been taking all of that into consideration for us. We will be recording the session, and it will be made available afterwards, I understand, on the MLF Monde YouTube site. So that, yeah, Jerome says yes, so that's good, 2 thumbs up. So we will share that afterwards. Some logistics during the presentation. We have allowed 1.5 hours for this session. If you need to drop off, you can access the recording later. So what we'll do is try to take the majority of questions in the last half an hour, 20 minutes or so. If you have a question during the presentation, just drop it into the chat, and I'll be monitoring that, and we can decide if we ask the question then or save it for the end. And then at the end, you'll have a chance to unmute yourself and ask any questions you have of Chantal. Okay. Again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Chantal. I'm going to pass it over to you, and if you want to share your screen and introduce yourself.
I can certainly do that. I'll start by sharing my screen. There you go. Alors, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hi, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here. And no, I'm not actually physically sitting in front of my garden. I did take that picture just a few minutes before signing on. I am in a tiny little bunkhouse, as we call it up here at our summer cottage. So my background is really not this pretty. So I will be presenting in English, but the slides are mostly in French. I am a native French speaker from Canada, so please feel free in the chat to ask your questions in French or in English. I can answer in both languages. I have no problems with that. So thank you very much, Ellen, for inviting me to speak with the MLF group today. I am thrilled and very excited to have this opportunity to talk to you about something that I'm extremely passionate about. So like she said, we're going to be talking about what it entails to acquire a French or a minority language in an English context, and trying to keep this minority language alive during remote learning. So the last few months have been challenging, but very awakening as well. Alors, comment acquérir le français dans un contexte anglophone et maintenir l'apprentissage de la langue minoritaire pendant l'enseignement à distance? Here are some of my social media accounts, my website. I tend to post a lot about bilingualism, about the acquisition of a minority language, but I also, as a speech and language pathologist, am very interested in developmental language disorder, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that. So I post about mainly those 2 topics. So please feel free to send me a message on any of those accounts. Like I said, it's where I try to send out the most information. So by the end of this talk, as you saw when you registered, You should be able to explain the difference between the acquisition of a minority language and that of a majority language as a second language. So there are some very important nuances there. Also be able to name the key elements required for language acquisition, be it your first language, your second, third, fourth. Explain the difference between language learning and language acquisition. Identify certain risk factors that may make the acquisition of a second language more difficult. And explain how certain populations may find it more difficult than others to learn a second language, as well as explore different strategies that can be used in the school or home setting to facilitate the acquisition and maintenance of a minority language, and kind of always in the context of distant or learning from home. So I'll try to give these strategies as we move forward and not just save them all at the end, but I do need to cover a little bit of information before we get to number 6. So who am I? I am like I said, a speech and language pathologist. I have been a practicing clinician for about 18 years now, but in the last decade, or a little over a decade, I've been a professor at the School of Speech and Language Pathology at Laurentian University here in Sudbury, Canada. And essentially, my interest in bilingualism and developmental language disorder stems from working in school boards and finding it difficult to identify when a child is struggling to learn a minority language because he or she has a language disorder versus the struggles that we see in children who may not be sufficiently exposed to that language, or who just don't have an underlying disorder, but for whatever reason, they're not acquiring that minority language as we would expect them to. I am also, like I said, a native speaker of French. I grew up in a small community, in a remote community here in Northern Ontario. I went to French elementary school, French high school, did most of my university studies in French. And I married an Anglophone, and we have 3 children who we are raising as bilingual children. So here in our context, because in Canada, we do have the 2 official languages, French and English. English is spoken by about 70-75% of the population, and then French about 25 to 30. But English is definitely predominant, and most kids prefer to engage in social interactions in English. All of the media that they consume is mostly in English, and studies have shown that. So in a nutshell, that's who I am, that's what I do. I am also the host of the Parle Podcast. You can see that on the top of the slides there. It's a podcast for the general public, and I try to raise awareness about the importance of communication, how communication is a basic human right. I talk about bilingualism, I talk about the minority language, I talk about obviously developmental language disorder, but check it out, there's quite a few episodes on there now. I've been the host for about 1.5 years, and have been loving it ever since. So when we're talking about learning a minority language, we're talking about learners who don't speak that language as their first language, or we can also talk about someone who is learning that minority language as their first language. We talk about here in our context as Franco-dominant. And so some children who are born in a French family but are exposed to English, they're right away they are bilingual. And so when you live in a context, even in the United States, if there are children who are born in a French home or another minority language, there is so much English around us that it's almost impossible to not become bilingual by the age of 4, even studies have shown. There is the distinction between a French medium school and a French immersion program, as you know. And then in the context of this presentation, when I'm going to be talking about the majority language, I'm talking about English. And when I talk about the minority language, it'll be French, even though there are many, many other minority languages, because the children are mostly instructed in French and in their home language, as well as English. Those are the ones that I'll be referring to. I recently published a brief article. It's about 1,000 words in La Conversation, which is an international or internationally known journal published by researchers. And in here, I talk about how we can increase exposure to the minority language during confinement, during the pandemic. And I did pretty much the same article in English. So you have the links there. A lot of the information that I'll be talking about today are in these two articles. And then there's a lot of links to various materials and websites that I recommend. Now, just keeping in mind that this is for the Canadian context, but a lot of the tips and tricks are universal. I like showing this slide, even though it's a bit dated because we now have about 7.8 billion people in the world, but it just goes to show what languages are spoken as native languages around the world. So we see that Chinese is one of the most common languages spoken as a native language in the world. And then we have French here with about 118 million. And then this next slide shows the languages that are learned as a second language. So English is by far the most common studied foreign language in the world. I just have to move and we don't even, oh yeah, French is up here with 82 million. So I start with this because it is no surprise that there isn't a whole lot of literature out there on the acquisition of French as a second language, because as we can see, there are so many other languages that are involved. So there are resources, but for the most part, a lot of the information that we find out there when we're typing in Google, it's children who are learning English as a second language. So this is my daughter when she was 9. She's now 13. And she said to me, and I'll read it in French and then I'll translate it in English. Maman, pourquoi est-ce que toutes les personnes qui parlent le français parlent aussi l'anglais, mais les personnes qui parlent l'anglais ne parlent pas tous le français? So, Mom, why is it that all people who speak French also speak English, but people who speak English don't all speak French? So this was just something that she just randomly blurted out, but I thought it was interesting that she noticed that at a pretty young age that, you know, I speak both languages, but when I speak to someone who is Anglophone, they don't necessarily speak French. And so I have a lot of conversations with my children about what it means to learn a minority language. And I think that that is very important. And I'll come back on that several times during this talk. So when we talk about the acquisition of a second language, or a minority language, I should say, I've come up with 5 scenarios. When I started my PhD, I was, in Google Scholar and trying to find information, and I kept falling or stumbling on the same types of studies. It was always about children from immigrant families who spoke a heritage language in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, who were learning English as their second language. And so it became very frustrating because that's not at all what I was looking for. So these are the 5 scenarios that we kind of tend to see. So we have the child who speaks the majority language of the community. So he is a majority language speaker. That child is learning a minority language, so let's say French. But he's learning this minority language in a French immersion school. And typically, French immersion programs are, I've got the French words in my head here, they are created, for lack of a better word, by the majority. So it's a school that has been established by the majority for the majority. And so this majority speaker is learning a minority language, but he's always in a community where he or she as a person is a majority learner. So examples here are the Anglophone who's learning French in French immersion schools outside of Quebec or in the United States. An Anglophone who's learning Spanish in immersion schools in the United States. An Anglophone who's learning Mandarin in immersion schools in the United States. So we're really talking about the majority language speaker who is learning a minority language in an immersion program designed for majority learners. A lot of research has been conducted on this group. So again, if you're Googling, you're going to find a plethora of research on this specific population. The second scenario is, there aren't too many of these. So this is the speaker who he or she is a minority in his community. They are learning the majority language, but they are learning it in a school, in an immersion school for the minority. So I'll just kind of skip ahead here. Really, some of the only contexts are the Anglophone children who are required to learn French in Quebec, Canada. And so actually some of the first immersion schools were developed in Quebec in the 70s. And it was for this group, this particular group. So any Anglophone speaker in Quebec must be enrolled in a French school, but they are French immersion schools for these speakers. A lot of research, again, on this population, and they've shown that children can learn both languages without any significant language loss, given that both languages are the official languages of the country, and because English is the lingua franca of the world, and they are learning a majority language, but in their community, French is the majority language. So a very unique case, but just be careful when you're researching about second language acquisition that you're not stumbling on researches that are on this topic or on this population. So the third scenario, so we have a majority speaker who is learning a minority language. This time they're not in an immersion school. They're in a school, a French medium school. So they are a majority speaker, but they are learning in a minority context, and the school is not necessarily designed for them. So we might have the Anglophone who is learning French in the States, but it's not necessarily a school designed for them. An Anglophone who's learning Maori in New Zealand, a Hispanophone learning Basque in Spain, an Anglophone learning Irish in Ireland, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the majority speaker learning a minority language in a school for the minority. There is the body of research on this population is increasing, but it's still not as common as the first two scenarios. The fourth scenario, take another sip. We have a minority speaker. So let's say someone who is French, learning the French language in a French school. And so here, it's like a minority learning a minority language in a minority school. So there's a lot of minorities here. So examples of this are Francophone learning French in a French school in the United States, Maori learning Maori in New Zealand, Basque learning Basque in Spain, and Irish learning Irish in Ireland, etc. Again, we're starting to see a bit of research on this population, but it's not as common as the other first two scenarios. And again, it's very different because they're learning a language that is spoken by the minority, and so they're not as frequently exposed. And the last scenario is very similar. So it's a minority speaker, but this time it can be any other language. It can be, so if I just fast forward here, it can be Arabic, Somalian, Creole. So they are a minority group learning another minority language in whether it be a French immersion program or a French medium school. So again, they are themselves a minority, learning a minority language in a context where all around them is English or Spanish that is spoken. So those are kind of the 5 scenarios to look out for. And there are some pretty significant differences between these scenarios. And we'll touch on that in a little bit. Okay. So here is, I used to write a lot of blogs, but blogs kind of got replaced for the most part by podcasts, so I haven't written one in a while, but this is one I wrote a few years back. These are my 3 kids, and it was tips and tricks on how to keep the minority language at the forefront. So you do have the link there, and I will be sharing the slides after this presentation. And I just gave a little example of my children speaking to each other as I was, off to the side trying to get some work done. So this is where you can find that on my website. So my oldest says, "Je vais retourner avec mon bateau." So I will come back with my boat. My youngest, Sarah, "Je vais sauter." I will jump. Whoops. Matt says, "Let's go. I'm going tubing." So my middle child, Julianne, says, "Sarah, let's go." Sarah says, "Matt, I said I was jumping." "Je sais, je veux sauter." I know, I want to jump. Matt says, "Sarah, hurry up." Then he turns to his sister and says, "Julianne, assis-toi en avant." Julianne, sit down in the front. And then Julianne says, "Je wish que je pourrais diver." So here we have some nice, off le dock. So here we have some nice code switching. I wish I could dive off the dock. And so, as a researcher and a speech language pathologist and an advocate for minority languages, I was listening to this and thinking, oh my goodness, my children are really mixing up the 2 languages here. But I knew that I didn't have to worry about this. They are just using whatever language comes to them, not really thinking, oh, I need to speak only in French or I need to speak only in English. And it's very natural and normal for them to alternate between the 2 because they know that between the 3 of them, they know the 2 languages. And so, code switching, a lot of studies have been done on code switching, code mixing, alternance de code, and it's not something to be worried about because for the most part, children keep the proper syntax and grammatical markers. And so here, if we just look at this last one here, je wish que je pourrais diver. And so here she takes the verb dive and conjugates it in French. And so kids know the grammatical rules in both languages, and then they will conjugate the verbs accordingly, even when they borrow a word from the other language. So it's quite a sophisticated process, cognitive process that is taking place. So even though we don't necessarily have to worry about this, I always try to encourage my children to pick one, just so that they can practice, especially French. They don't tend to code mix in the majority language as much. They tend to code switch when they're speaking French, and then they tend to switch. So when they are speaking French, I try to encourage them, just think about your words. And then I always say to them, if you don't use it, you lose it. And that's very true for languages. So when we're learning a second language, so thus far I've been talking mostly about learning a minority language. Okay, so if you look at the definition of what a minority language is, some say that it's when a language is spoken by less than 50% of the population, but there's a continuum, right? You can have some languages that are spoken by 5% of the population up to 50, anywhere in between. So here's more specifically, what does it look like when a child is learning a second language? And so we have simultaneous bilingualism. So that is both languages from birth or before the age of 3. And then we have sequential bilingualism. So that is a first language has been acquired, and then after the age of 3, they are introduced to a second, third, fourth language. And what's really important here are the hours of exposure to the languages. And I'll come back on that. Just keep that in mind. Catherine Conert is a colleague who is now retired, but she did a lot of work on second language acquisition and developmental language disorders, and she came up with the MOM acronym. So the MOM is what we need to learn a first language, a second language, a third language. We need the means, the opportunities, and the motivation. What are the means? Well, the means are essentially our cognitive abilities. And when I talk about cognition, language is included in cognition. So we've got language, attention, memory, organization skills, reasoning skills, all of these executive functions that are necessary to be able to learn a language. And so a child who is born with a specific syndrome or who may have a significant intellectual disability, they can learn a second language, but they might need extra support. Actually, a lot of studies have been conducted on special populations such as Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, autism even. And these children can learn a second language. There are very few studies, if any, that say the opposite. But that child will need extra help and they will need a lot of exposure to the language. Which brings me to the next one, opportunities. Children need to be exposed to the language. And while we're doing this remote learning, this is one area where we've seen a decline. So where children were getting most of their exposure in school, they kind of lost a lot of that, even though they were still connecting through Zoom or whatever other platform to their teachers. They've lost a lot of that socializing and the opportunities to use the language. And a lot of studies now are showing that when we're talking about exposure and opportunities, what matters here is quality as much as quantity. And so for years, when we had immigrant families who had their child enrolled in an English school, let's say, so they spoke a heritage language at home, Arabic, we would tell them, well, don't speak your heritage language at home, speak English, because we really want to increase this exposure. But what that was doing is the child was now receiving input in English from non-native speakers who didn't really have very proficient skills in English. So now that the child was hearing, a lot of errors and then what happens too when we're recommending this is language is attached to emotion. It's attached to attachment. And so these parents weren't really able to have these affectionate conversations with their children anymore. So we no longer recommend families to drop their native language at home, but we do recommend that they try to find genuine opportunities for exposure to the target language. So in our case, French. So Ellen Therdardatier is a researcher here in Canada at McGill University in Montreal, but she is also from Iceland. And she has conducted many studies in Iceland as well as in Canada. And she has discovered that for a child to learn a second language, I'm really thinking in French and having to translate as I go along here in my head. So, to master that language, similarly to another child who speaks it as their native language. So if we have an English child in a French school, we want to compare that English child to a francophone, or a child who speaks French as their native language. For them to have similar expressive vocabulary, so the vocabulary that they use, the English child has to be exposed to the French language 40% of his or her waking hours. And so during the day, if we're looking at a child is awake from, let's say, 7 a.m. until 8 p.m., that's 13 hours, well, they have to be exposed to French 40% of that time. It's a lot. And this is for I said vocabulary that they use. This is the vocabulary that they understand. So 40% is for the vocabulary that they understand. In her study, she shows that in order for them to produce a vocabulary that is equivalent to a monolingual peer, they have to be exposed to the language 60% of their waking hours. And so this is if you want the child to have native speaker proficiency. Do you want them to speak French like a native speaker of French? So, I always tell parents and teachers, you have to ask yourself that question. What is your goal? What are you looking for? And then the last one for mom is the motivation. And so you really need to want to learn the language to learn it. It's not going to happen by osmosis. The child has to see the benefits of learning the language in order to want to learn that language. And that often comes with the opportunities. The more the child has opportunities, the more he or she will be motivated to speak that language because it's something that is frequent. So I won't have you listen to this little podcast excerpt, but it's someone that I had interviewed, and she talked about motivation. And she said in her school growing up as a bilingual speaker in a French medium school, the teachers would often give them tokens. And the more they spoke French amongst themselves, the more tokens they got. And at the end of the week, when they had a certain number of tokens, they got pizza. So we just kind of caution that what is the motivation here? It's an extrinsic motivation, right? So it's not coming from within. And so is a child motivated to speak the language, or is he motivated to get the pizza? So just kind of keep that in mind. We have to give them that internal motivation, give them a lot of opportunities, and for them to see the value of speaking that language. So when we're learning a second language sequentially, so after the age of 3, these are the typical processes that we would expect to see. So we might even see a period of silence where the child is not really speaking at all, not talking in class. We're not worried about that. That is, they're kind of taking it all in. If the child is speaking a heritage language at home, we sometimes see the loss of that language, even more so when the parents are told not to speak their language at home. So now that we know not to make that recommendation, we're seeing a little bit less of this, but it is still possible. And then we're going to see that code switching, which I showed you earlier. And sometimes we see transfer from one language to the other. Sometimes, in French, in English, we say the blue truck. In French, we say le camion bleu. So the adjective comes after the noun. So sometimes we see le bleu camion. So we see that transfer. So this is all typical second language acquisition behavior. So here are just some fun facts. So I've already told you that 40% to understand a language. And then this is part of the article that talks about how 40 to 60% of exposure is required for them to use the language like native speakers of that language. I'll just skip over that. Okay, that's another fun fact relating to that. So I did interview Dr. Ellen Thordartier on the podcast. So if you wanted to take a listen, it's in French, but she talks about the acquisition of a minority language in Canada, in Iceland, and what we need to look out for. When do we worry? So I will talk about some of the risk factors, but there is a full hour episode on the podcast. I think it's season 1, episode 11. So on my website, and you can either go to butboot.com or the parlepodcast.com, it takes you the same. I've created some forms to try and obtain this percentage. So maybe you're asking yourselves, well, how do you know 40%, 60%? And I'm just going to mute myself and cough 1 minute. I've already taught a 2-hour class today, and I'm really realizing that my voice is not happy with me. Okay, so I've created this form, and it is available on my website, where I have the list of activities, kind of your most common activities. So here, conversations at home, at school, or on the bus, activities, after school, friends, homework, electronic devices, and reading. And I asked the parents to complete or to estimate the number of hours the child spends in both languages. And so we do this for the 7 days of the week, because some days may be different than others. And then at the end, there's a very easy formula, and we get our percentage of hours of exposure to both languages. And if there's a third language, by all means, they can do that for the third language. And this is often an eye-opener for parents. I know it was for myself. I did it with my kids in October, and our exposure to French was roughly 70-80%. But then I did it during the Christmas holidays, and we saw a pretty significant shift. Most of the activities that we were doing in the community, downhill skiing, visiting my spouse's family, which is Anglophone, the exposure to the English language went up quite a bit, and same thing during the summer months. So it's a good way of having parents realize that, oh, okay, maybe I do need to give my child some more opportunities in the French language. I recently participated in a conference a couple of weeks ago, and it's an international conference on bilingualism and developmental language disorder. And Elma Blom, who is a well-known researcher in the field, said, input needs to become intake in order for children to build stable language representations. L'intrant doit devenir une entrée afin que les enfants puissent construire des représentations linguistiques stables. So what does this mean? I really had to think about that. And then, you know, it kind of comes back to what I was saying. It doesn't suffice to have the child just hear the language. They need to want to learn it. It needs to mean something to them. They need to be motivated to learn it. They need to process it. And that's why you can't put a child in front of a television and have them learn a language. They'll pick up bits and pieces, but they're not really going to acquire this language. So now I'm coming to that part about learning versus acquisition. So learning, l'apprentissage, is the process by which the linguistic competency is the result of that process. In French, there's two different words here, but I'm translating on the fly. And so learning is a process. It is something that takes time, and for some it'll take longer. Whereas acquisition was the result of that process. It is the transformation of that information into knowledge. And knowledge that, if we want to get really into psychology, that is ingrained into the child's long-term memory. And knowledge that is also associated with personal experiences. And they can then attribute meaning and emotion to that knowledge. Acquisition is a cognitive process. It is, it's not conscious. It is natural. It is not something that we can observe, but it makes them go from, zero competence in a language to a competence that is varied depending on the quantity and the quality of this acquisition. And so it really needs to be something that is, the learning needs to be intentional in order for it to become something that is acquired. We've all been through school and we've all learned some things that we didn't acquire, right? We memorized it, we learned it, yes, you write your test and poof, it's gone. So you did not acquire that skill. And so in a lot of the consultation that I do with schools, I talk about the importance of talking to children about this. Hey, you're learning a minority language, good for you. That's pretty special. And not a lot of kids have that privilege, but you know what? You really need to, work at it. And if the more you work at it, the easier it will become. And then just explain, what is a minority language? Why is it a bit harder? So it's something that I talk a lot about with my children as well. So there are, like I said, there are some learnings that don't end up being acquisitions. And I think I've pretty much said the rest. All right, so what are some of the contributing factors to the acquisition of a second language? So, and typically when I talk about second language in this context, I talk about sequential bilingualism. The kiddos that are learning two languages from birth almost learn those two languages like one language. And so they are a different population. I think that a lot of the children that you are working with are learning French as a second language and English as a second language if they have a different heritage language. So some of the factors that will contribute is age of acquisition. Did they learn before 3, after 3? Did they learn at age 10? Do they have an innate ability to learn languages? And so some children are more language based, some are more mathematical, some are more artsy, some are more, technically inclined. And so if they have that innate ability to learn languages easily, then, that'll make it easier for them. And here, do they have that willingness? Are they open to the idea of learning that second language and to learn the culture that comes with it? The exposure. We need an abundance of exposure to this language. So if you've got two children who have, a lot of the same characteristics, but one has more exposure than the other, then that one child will learn the language with more ease. There needs to be a kind of match between the pedagogy, the way that the child is taught, and the way that, or the proficiency. Although I am seeing more and more researches that come out saying that there is no such thing as a visual learner or a kinesthetic learner or an auditory learner. So, but I think overall here what we're saying is, sometimes the teacher and the child, they don't necessarily jive. And that happens, right? We've also have colleagues where we just don't see eye to eye. And so that will have an impact. It comes back to the motivation too. The amount of time that the child has been exposed to that language. So not only age of acquisition, because studies have shown that the younger the child is, the easier it is to learn. But here we're also talking about how long have they been exposed? 5 years, 6 years, 2 years. Socioeconomic status. So with most other concepts that are learned, if a child is from a low socioeconomic status, they might have more difficulties. And IQ, although a lot of studies have shown that children with low IQ, not intellectual disability low, but just below average, they can still learn language just fine. And then the cognitive load. So I have a link here, and I'll briefly take you to it. Oh, and I forget if I did. Did that go to the next page? Let me see if someone can give me a nod here. Can someone give me a nod if that went to that next page? You should be seeing avoiding working memory overload.
Yes, we do.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you. I forgot if I shared my desktop or if I had just shared the page. Okay.
You switched.
Thank you. So here is an article written by a colleague, Lisa Archibald, and she is a professor here in Canada, but she's done extensive research on working memory. And what I like about this is she talks about cognitive overload, essentially. And I'm just going to come down here. And these are some signs of working memory overload. So sometimes a child is able to learn a second language, but there's just too much going on. And so these are just signs. So if they give up or they stop attending, and you may have noticed this with some of the children that you were working with during this learning from home, that it was too much. To be able to organize their time, to sign on, to complete their tasks, to know where to go. I know my daughter, who has developmental language disorder as well as ADHD, it was just too much. And it's not that she couldn't learn the specific activity or lesson, it's that there was too much going on. So if they complete only a part of the task, become frustrated by the learning challenges, act out or engage in other distracting behaviors that are not typical. So I do recommend that you take a look. It's long, a pretty long article, but an easy read. And here we've got strategies on how to work on working memory, to give them strategies. So sometimes they are struggling to learn the language because they just can't keep it in their working memory long enough to learn it. Okay, so I'm back at the presentation. If you are not, let me know. So you have that link there in the slide. So here is a quote. The receptive knowledge, so what we understand of a word, is important. But if children only read or hear a new word, they are not really going to remember that word and will likely not even use that word. So again, when children are learning a new word, a new concept, we always need to turn it around and have them explain it to us. What did you understand? Tell me what that means in your words. You really want to give them that opportunity to tell you how they perceive that word. So bilingualism. Over the last decade or so, whenever I see an article in a magazine or in the New York Times or somewhere on social media about the benefits of bilingualism, I've kind of kept it along over the years. So this was in a Canadian magazine, Today's Parent, and it talks about, does exposing young children to two languages interfere with their learning? In most cases, no. Sometimes it even helps. So, we're talking about bilingualism and the advantages. New York Times, bilingualism can delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease. Again, New York Times 2012, being bilingual makes you smarter. This was a TED Ed video here on YouTube, and again, the benefits of a bilingual brain, and it talks about all of the benefits. BBC Future 2016, here we talk about the financial benefits of being bilingual. Here, brain connection, brain benefits of bilingualism, and here they list a whole bunch of benefits. So prevention of dementia, the ability to focus on tasks with more ease than a monolingual speaker, switching between tasks, improved cognitive skills, denser gray matter in the brain, improved memory, improved decision-making skills, more awareness of language, and so on. The Guardian 2018. More than half of the world's population is now bilingual, now thought to encourage flexibility of mind and empathy. Bilingual is also transforming societies, so, other benefits. Psychology Today. Here, we talk about older persons who are bilingual enjoy improved memory. It can delay the onset of Alzheimer's 4 to 5 years. In children, it's associated with better performance on some perceptual classification tasks, as well as increased cognitive flexibility and metacognitive skills. And very recently in January, being bilingual may help protect cognitive decline in multiple sclerosis patients. So all that to say, these are all the facts. This is based on science, but what we need to keep in mind are the participants that took place in these studies the same as the ones that we are seeing. And so these are some articles that parents are seeing on a daily basis almost. And they'll say, yeah, I'm going to enroll my child in a French school or in a French immersion or what have you. But what we need to keep in mind is there are a lot of factors, conditions, and variables that we need to keep in mind, that we need to consider. And so in order to have all of these benefits, the level of bilingualism is almost one of equal bilingualism. So the participants in these studies were exposed to both languages at at least 40 to 50% of their time. And so they are equal bilingual. So they're really benefiting from the bilingualism. We're not going to get the same results if the child is only exposed to the second language 20% of their waking hours. And so I think that's important for people to know. And again, I'm not dismissing any of these studies. These are well-known facts, but the participants are typically balanced bilinguals.
Chantal, maybe that's a really important point. Maybe you can just repeat that quickly.
Absolutely. And so all of these studies, whether it be about dementia, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, the benefits of a bilingual brain, so their ability to focus more on tasks, to switch between tasks, to have this improved memory, denser gray matter, all of these advantages and benefits are truly only present if the child is sufficiently exposed to both languages. And so if we have a child who is only exposed to the French language 20% of their waking hours and the rest of the time it's English, they're not necessarily going to see these advantages. In fact, Jim Cummins, and that's not in the presentation, but in the early 80s, he is a well-known researcher of bilingualism and how long it takes to acquire language. He showed, and it was kind of two ladders going up a house, and at the top of the house is where you have that balanced bilingualism. And he showed that you have those cognitive advantages when you're at the top, when you've really mastered both languages, but at the bottom, you might have some cognitive disadvantages, okay? So exposure is very important. So I will briefly touch on a developmental language disorder, just to kind of let you know that it exists, and it is a common disorder. It is more common than autism, just about as common as dyslexia, yet people don't really know about it. So there was a group of researchers, international researchers, Bishop and collaborator in 2016 and 2017, who came together and because this disorder was labeled in many different ways. We called it specific language impairment. We called it primary language impairment. We called it dysphagia. We called it language disorder, developmental language disorder. So they came up with developmental language disorder internationally. And essentially, it's like a learning disability of languages. So children have a hard time acquiring languages. So these are often children who have poor language structure, grammar, morphology, who have difficulty with vocabulary. So these are kids who, when they're describing something, are often using these empty words like thing, that, over there, this, like that. So they have a hard time using the precise vocabulary. When it comes to discourse, narrative, they have a hard time with the structure. And in social contexts, it's very difficult. And we see a lot of these kids with mental health problems later on in life. And studies are now showing that a lot of youth who are incarcerated actually have undiagnosed language disorders. And they will have difficulties with reading and writing. It's 7% of children. And in a classroom of about 30 students, it's 2 in every classroom. So you likely have a lot of students who have DLD, developmental language disorder, and you may not know about it because they're typically very good at hiding it. And when they speak, they're not using a poor grammar. Well, some of them have a hard time with verb tenses, but it's not that obvious. And it becomes more obvious as the curriculum is more demanding. So there's a video here, a link to a video. It's about 5 minutes, explains a little bit more about DLD. I have a page here on my website about DLD. This is how we diagnose DLD. I won't get to that, but if you want more information on that, I can certainly provide that information at a later time. And essentially, what interests me and a lot of researchers out there is that sometimes children who are learning a second language will show the same characteristics as children who have DLD. But the main cause of the difficulty for those children who are typically developing is lack of exposure, lack of motivation, and not an underlying language disorder. So that's what's very difficult to differentiate. Who is struggling because they have an underlying language disorder, and who is struggling because they just don't have enough exposure or don't see the value in learning a second language. So quickly here, a bilingual child who has DLD, or trouble développemental du langage, they will have difficulties in both languages in terms of sentence structure. They often have a low vocabulary scores in both languages. They also often have difficulty with discourse in both languages. They have difficulty socially in both languages, difficulty reading and writing in both languages. And often there's the family history, not always, but often. And they often have a hard time with all of these metacognitive abilities. So the ability to estimate if something will be difficult, to recognize their errors, to know, estimate how long it will take them to do a task. So they have a hard time with all of that. A child who is bilingual, but who is typically developing, will not have difficulty in their first language. So the difficulties are typically only present in their second language. However, not for vocabulary. So it is expected that children who are bilingual struggle or have a lower vocabulary in both languages. But when you combine the two, it adds up, and it's sometimes even a higher vocabulary than their monolingual peers. And for the rest, it's only in the first language. So the second language, it's only in the second language. So the first language is fine. Okay. There's a little children's book that my students put together on my website, just explaining a little bit more about DLD in French. So it is with children in mind as a target audience. So here I have a few slides that, so I'm part of a developmental language disorder support group on Facebook. And during the learning from home pandemic, a lot of parents went on there and were saying like, wow, I really didn't realize how much my child was struggling in school until, I was sitting beside him. He's really getting by and just pretending in school. So these are all quotes about, it's so hard. My own words get muddled because I just can't think of another way to explain things. I really struggle to explain things to her. It's actually impossible. He really needs one-on-one. Here, I think there are going to be a lot of parents questioning teachers when schools return. As you say, it's only your experience that has helped to highlight your older son's possible difficulties. Our kids are so good at masking their problems. So here, this person wasn't necessarily saying that it's the teacher's fault. I think it's that the child is so good at masking the problem. We call it often the Cinderella disorder. So it's hidden, yet very common. So there's a few more quotes like this. This last one here, my son is 12, has DLD. I cannot leave his side or his mind wanders and he distracts himself with everything, including the sense and spray automatic air freshener. So this brings me to this next slide. A lot of children with DLD have concomitant disorders. So about 30 to 50% of children with DLD also have ADHD. About 50% of children with DLD also have dyslexia and a learning disorder. So there's a lot going on with these kids. All right, so those are the kids that are at risk of having a difficult time learning a second language. Can they learn a second language? Absolutely. And studies have shown this time and time again, provided they get the sufficient amount of exposure and support to learn a second language. Okay. So these are some of the studies I've conducted. So I talk a lot about when I'm doing consulting in schools about this mindset. So we kind of have to change our mindset a little bit as adults or professionals working with these kids, that we need to talk about this. So I use this is kind of that metacognition. So it's our ability to think about the way we think and think about language. And we need to transfer that to kids. We need to teach the kids that they're learning a minority language, and this is what you need to learn a minority language. And we tend to kind of assume that they will just get it on their own. But more and more studies are showing that we need to explicitly teach that they are learning a minority language and a second or third language, and that this is what they need to do, and parents as well. So this was just a fun fact about vocabulary knowledge. And so a lot of studies have shown that vocabulary is very important for success in school. So I don't know when this quote is coming. At some point, I think I have it, that vocabulary in junior kindergarten or senior kindergarten can predict vocabulary in grade 12. And so we really need to work on kids on their vocabulary acquisition, not just learning. They need to acquire these words, and not just basic vocabulary. And I know it's 5 o'clock, but this is really important. So I'm going to skip here. This is a book called Bringing Words to Life by Beck and collaborators. And if you know of it, I'm thrilled to hear that. If not, I strongly recommend it. It talks about how to teach vocabulary. And there's even a chapter here about second language acquisition, although it's English as a second language, but the concepts are still the same. And which words to teach. So we often tend to, at least here in a lot of the schools in Canada, to teach a lot of the basic words, especially when it comes to second language learners. But we don't teach the words that are used academically. So words like reflect, process, estimate, acknowledge. So those are level 2 words, as they describe them in the book, that need explicit teaching. And we often don't teach those yet. They are in a lot of the textbooks that the kids read, even in some of the tests that are given. So according to these authors, there's a continuum when we're learning a word. So we go from not knowing the word at all, aucune connaissance. Then the next one, let's say the word is paresseux. There's a typo here, but I fixed it in another slide. So lazy. And so the child might know, oh, okay, I feel like that's negative. You know, sometimes my parents call me paresseux, and I know it's not a good thing, but I don't really know what it means. The second level is they might understand it, but can't quite use it in a sentence. And then the fourth step is they know the word, they can use the word, and they've acquired it. So the whole theme of the book is that we need to teach kids to want to learn new words, and when they stumble upon a word that they don't know, to try to figure it out and to question and to be curious about this word and have discussions, and then see if they have some personal experiences associated with that word. There are 3 levels to a word. So before I talked about 4 steps in the acquisition of a word. Here it's 3 different types of words. The first level are the words that the kids know before they even come to school, like dog, happy, mom, police, officer, book, apple. They know these words. You don't need to teach them. They may not know them in their second language, so that's we do need to teach them that if they're learning French for the first time. The level 2 words, like I was saying, are words that are used on a daily basis by proficient speakers, but that the child probably doesn't know. And they are used in many different contexts, like maintain, privileged, conduct, reflect, like I was saying. And the level 3 words are words that are very specific to a topic. So if we're talking about the ecosystem, we may talk about community, population, organism, biology. So they're very specific. We're not going to use those words in many different contexts. So we want to focus on these level 2 words as much as possible. And the good news is level 2 words are often cognates, so which means they're the same in both languages. Maintenir, maintain, privilégier, privilege, réfléchir, reflect, calculer, calculate. So but it's not to say that because they're a cognate word that the child will make that association, but if we can teach them that, that, hey, if it sounds the same, it's probably the same thing. Not always, but for the most part. So there is a podcast about this. I know I kind of touched on it very briefly. So this is from the, I should have written it up here, from the Science of Reading podcast. And this episode here talks about second language acquisition. And she talks about the 3 levels of vocabulary. And she talks about the ABCs, how 1, we want to assess what the child understands. 2, we want to build background about what we're teaching. And 3, we want to check on their comprehension. So I do recommend that you check out this podcast. It's about an hour long, and 37 minutes, that's just where she starts to talk about the ABCs. So this is just about the 3 levels of the words. I wrote 2 brief articles about this on a Canadian website about learning disability and learning, but it's applicable to typically developing kids at all. So you have the links there. And if I can just finish with Scarborough's reading rope. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is science of reading. This is what we need for to learn how to read. And a lot of it is language and vocabulary. And the more we can focus on the language part, yes, decode phonics is important. Phonological awareness is important, but that's only one strand of the rope. So we really want to talk about vocabulary, language, verbal reasoning, background knowledge, knowing that not all children come to school with the same background knowledge. And so this itself could be another hour talk, but I just thought I'd put it in there so we don't forget that language is very, very important. And our kids who are learning French as a second language may not have a lot of these competencies in place, which may then explain why they have a hard time reading. So I'm going to stop there and maybe give you a chance to ask questions.
Chantal, thank you so much for
You're
that.
very welcome.
So many salient points and very relevant to our context. So I'm sure people have questions. Please feel free to unmute yourself and say hello to Chantal and ask your question.
Hello, Chantal.
Hello? Yeah. There you go.
This is Kofi calling from Togo.
Hello, all the way from Togo.
Yeah. Well, I find very interesting the teaching, and I just wonder, when can you give this kind of teaching in French for those who are really interested in following that?
When can I give the same workshop in French, or when?
Yes, exactly.
Bien, c'est quelque chose qui peut être organisé avec MLF. So, you know, I will take some holidays in July, but, you know, we can discuss that possibility for sure.
That's good.
Yeah. When we approached Chantal, we did talk about possible future sessions. We could dig a lot deeper into anything presented today, also more practical applications, also French fully. So we can discuss that, right?
Thank you.
Other questions?
I just have a question, Chantal. I don't know if you're hearing me. You spoke at the beginning about minority language. Would you define minority language the same thing as second language, or is there any difference between both?
Yes, that's a very good question. And there is a pretty important difference between both. So a minority language, and there are various definitions out there, but a common one is that it is a language spoken by less than 50% of the people in that community. And so that becomes a minority language. So you can have a minority language as your first language.
All right.
Second language acquisition, you can be acquiring a second language, and that second language can be a majority language, or it can be a minority language. And so those are two different concepts.
Okay, can you add the definition to the slides, please? Or can we find it somewhere, please? I think it's very important, because I understand you're speaking about the North American context, but I teach at the French school in Bahrain, and we come from a very different context where honestly, we have a majority of students, and this is a question I ask, that we can say they don't have a first language, like they speak the Arabic, the English, the French, but you cannot even tell which comes first, which is the language that is mastered and that is a reference to other languages.
So they would have learned all three simultaneously from birth?
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, they would learn, let's say, in a specific context, Arabic from birth. They are exposed to English because they are a lot with nannies and, you know, home carers. I don't know how you call it. And then they come to school, and this is where they are exposed to French. And this is only where they are exposed to French.
Yes, actually, I was talking about Ellen Third-Arditier, who has conducted some studies in Iceland, and she has found the same results, if you want to call it that, in Iceland, where children are speaking Danish, Icelandic, and English. And some of her studies have shown that by, early teenage years, they are not really competent in either one of those languages. And essentially her conclusions are that it's because the children are not sufficiently exposed. So there's not one language where they have at least 40 to 60% of exposure. All languages are, 30%, And so they don't have native-like proficiency in either one of the languages. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about. They're exposed to many languages, but they don't have one that is kind of that foundation.
So what would be the solution to this? Would you say that native proficiency is a must? When you address to parents, I mean, some of the problems you're having in the class.
I think that's a very loaded question, and it depends on the community. And so is native proficiency the goal? I think that really depends on the community and what that looks like for future employment. And so if they really need to have proficiency in at least one of the languages, then I would recommend maybe increasing the exposure to one of the languages. But I think it really depends, and it's a case by case, depending on the communities.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Chantal, we have a question in the chat about related to vocabulary acquisition. Would you recommend the use of bilingual vocabulary lists, flashcards in both minority and majority languages?
So I think it's important to teach children that some words are cognates, so they're the same in both languages, but because they sound so different, they don't often make that link. So if I say communication and then I say communication, if we don't, I mean, it's hard for us, right? Because when I say that word, you see it in writing. But if you're just hearing it, it doesn't at all sound like the same word. And so I think when we show those lists, if we want to start with those words, then we're showing them. And one thing I should add is when we're teaching vocabulary, studies have shown that when you teach the vocabulary and you add text and you talk about the phonological components of the word, the syllables and the words, and it starts with what sound, they will acquire that word more easily than if you just give them the verbal, the auditory word. And so, yes, flashcards are, I don't know that I would just drill, because again, that's giving them the input, but not ensuring that intake. So you want them to make links with their personal experiences. And the book, Bringing Words to Life, has so many different strategies, and it's really not expensive. You can get it on Amazon for, I think it's under $20, and has so many ideas on how we can help children learn words, not just learn them, but really acquire them. And I do have a workshop about that. It is, it takes a while to get through all the strategies, but certainly flashcards alone gives them that input, but does not ensure that intake. Okay, and do you want me to look at that other question?
Yeah, there's another question there in the chat. You can take that one, the difference between a couple of the
okay, so it says between simultaneous bilingualism and sequential bilingualism, i.e. second language acquired after 3 years of age, or 2. Which one is a better approach to develop both languages more efficiently? So they're both very different, and we don't necessarily compare the two if you're talking about here simultaneous versus sequential. So studies have shown that people who learn the 2 languages simultaneously learn them differently. In fact, it is MRI scans have shown that it is more in the basal ganglia part of the brain, which is kind of that deep matter in the brain. Whereas when we're learning a second language sequentially, it's the prefrontal cortex that is activated. And the prefrontal cortex requires more, it's the part of the brain that is responsible for like that memory, organization, intentional learning. So I wouldn't say that one is better than the other, they're just different. And if we have a lot of exposure and the child is learning that language after the age of 3, they can learn it and become very proficient speakers of that language. Hope that answers your question. But so these studies with MRI have shown that learning a second language sequentially is more difficult than learning the 2 languages simultaneously. because the prefrontal cortex requires a little bit more intention. It's not, whereas the basal ganglia, it's not conscious. They're not learning the two. They're not, thinking about learning the languages. They're just learning them. So I hope that. And then I have, some people boast to speak proficiently 7 languages. Is it a myth or a reality? What is their definition of proficiency? And so is it in the 4 domains? Speaking, understanding, reading, and writing? Yes, you can learn 7 languages, and we see it all the time in a lot of European countries. But are they really proficient? And that you can learn, speak a language socially, but are you able to have, I don't know, a political debate in that language? Are you really able to give your opinion and to talk more abstractly in that language? Probably not. Basal ganglia in French is noyaux gris centraux.
Chantal, hi, this is Shannon from Lila in Los Angeles, and I wanted to piggyback off the question about vocabulary lists. I'm familiar with the information regarding the different tiers of vocabulary and how we want to focus on tier 2 words. However, connecting that to bilingual language learning, we have our English program and our French program. I understand we're going to want to definitely let the students see the words visually, connected to their phonemes and their roots of meaning whenever possible. Do you have any suggestions on how we can make any connections to, should we be working bilingually on this? I know it's best when it's done in meaningful context, so not just a list of words to learn, but how could we really take advantage of their home language and having teachers in that home language to connect those cognates?
Yeah, and that is important. And so that's why I kind of like cognates, because you can work with the families. And so I often use the analogy of an iceberg, and I am sorry about my drawing, but it'll be quicker than me trying to find the actual picture. And this is Jim Cummins' work. I'm not coming up with this on my own. So on top, you would have the 2 peaks of the iceberg, or so here we would have L1, L2. Here we would have L1. But as you know, under the iceberg is way bigger. And so here are the concepts. All the knowledge. And there's so much more down here. So by using cognates, we can ensure that the child at home in their home language are really understanding the concept of that word. And so in their L1, they can be talking about, if we're using those level 2 words, what does it mean to reflect, réfléchir? What does it mean to, raisonner, to reason, even words like effrayer, be frightened, level 2 words. So they can work on those concepts at home. And then what we're doing after is we're just giving them the label here. This is, the concept is there, and then we're giving it the label in the second language. So the research has shown that it is quite helpful to work on similar structures in both languages. And that's not only for vocabulary, we can also use syntax. Luckily, French and English have, similar syntax, not always, but subject, verb, object. It does vary with the adjectives in that, but even just the concept of a sentence, the concept of syllables, the concept of phonological awareness. If the child understands what is a rhyme in their native language in English, then when we're talking about rhymes in French, they'll already have this underlying proficiency. And then we're just teaching it in a second language. So the question that I had earlier about those 3 languages, what worries me is if you're adding, a third language here, is that if they have very little, concepts and that those fundamental skills, then it'll be really hard. What are you building on? So you really want to make sure that they understand and have that knowledge in at least one of the languages. I hope that answers.
Bonjour, Karine de FAIS à Portland, en Oregon. Alors, est-ce que vous pouvez nous donner des petites informations pour continuer à garder l'enseignement du français pendant le remote learning, quand on a des enfants en Zoom qui ne mettent pas leur caméra ou qui ne disent rien? Merci. Et je me remute parce que je
Ça va. Pas tout ça. Merci pour votre question. So the question was, do I have any recommendations on how to support the exposure to the French language during remote learning? So I didn't get a chance to share with you. So if I come back to my, oh, hang on, I'll just share my desktop. Then wait, I'm sure that you see everything. Desktop, okay. Okay, so on my website, parlepodcast.com, on the English side, I haven't had a chance to put it on the French side. I will get to it, but the information is there in both languages anyway. So if you go to useful resources, printable page, there are a lot of free resources there on how to increase exposure to the French language at home. So here I have tips for 4 to 10-year-olds. So a lot of French applications, donc les applications qui peuvent être utilisées en français. There are audiobooks. I talk about Skyping with other family members or other children. And then here for older kids. And then here, this is more specific to your question. And I hope it's okay that I answer in English. Or do you prefer, est-ce que tu préfères en français?
No, I speak English.
Okay, parfait. So my students and I have prepared a few activities. So here we have Hangman is one. And it's, like I said, all of the instructions are written in both languages. And we actually did this when we prepared the presentation for Catherine. So if we want to play Hangman by video conference. So just to give you a little bit of background, when I would try this with my own children, I say, hey, why don't you have a Zoom call with your friend? And so you guys can practice French. Well, they would sit there in front of the camera with their friends and just make silly faces and talk about not a whole lot. So I thought, okay, I think we need a bit of structure. So here they can play bonhomme pendu or hangman. And so here are, some words that can be easily illustrated. And by using the whiteboard like I did, then they can play hangman and guess. So this is giving them words or a bit of context or a bit of structure. And then so they're talking in French and they're also writing in French if they're able to write. I also have some strategies for Pictionary, ou fais-moi un dessin. Could have just kept sharing, I'm not sure why. Okay. So Pictionary, so you can do Pictionary online or you can do Pictionary in the same way. So this here is a website, free website, that allows you to play Pictionary when you're, remotely. And so it gives you the word. It's called Scribble.io. And then all of the instructions are here, but then you're able to guess and write again with your friends. So we're trying to increase the exposure to French, but also making it fun. Because again, we want that intake. So there's this one, and if they can't write, if they're not spelling yet, then you can just use the whiteboard and they can draw using the whiteboard. We also did a treasure hunt for some of the really little kids. And this one, I used the website ThingLink. And I'm gonna have to take off my speaking here. So here, what I did was we recorded our voice. And so if they can't read, so the idea here is both kids have this template in front of them. And they have to name objects around. So I've got one for the bedroom, one for the kitchen, and one for the living room, I believe. And so they have to name something in their immediate space that it represents this object. So,
nomme un objet jaune.
Nomme un objet jaune, so name a yellow object.
Donne le titre d'un livre. Qu'est-ce que ton parent fait en ce moment?
And so these are really for those who can't read, can't write, and what are they going to talk about? So here they've got 3 templates, and these are examples. You can create as many as you want. And then I have one for maybe a little bit older kids. So these are just topics. Whoops, did I switch pages here? No. Conversation starters. So again, if you just ask them to talk, they may not know what to talk about. Vacances d'été, summer holidays. So here we want them to share, what do you want to do during your summer holidays? But we add that when it is your friend's turn, if they say to you, well, I really want to go to cet été, je veux nager dans ma piscine. This summer, I want to swim in my pool. Then the other one has to ask something about that and not just finish it there. So you're also teaching, conversation roles at the same time. Est-ce que ta piscine est profonde? Is your pool really deep? So we have another one that's jeu préféré, favorite game, les saisons, seasons, special memories that they have, des souvenirs. So there's a few conversation starters there just to help them have those conversations between peers. And I think that was it for the most part. So the idea behind this is that a lot of the activities that are suggested in these ones are more giving them the input. So if you're looking at apps in French, well, they're just hearing the language. They're not using it. They're French, so it's good. It's better than nothing. And I recommend these. Some of these are they have an English title, but you go in the settings and you put it in French. Here I have some of my episodes on the Parle Podcast. I talk about, they're just very brief episodes, about 15 minutes. And we use this level 2 vocabulary while making a recipe, while making a craft, what was the other one? I forget. But I've recorded them 100% in French or with an introduction in English, French dialogue, and then with myself and my 2 daughters. And so the parents can understand what's going on, even though most of it is in French. So they're getting that exposure. There are French podcasts here that they can listen to, French television shows, etc. But all of those activities, they're only hearing it. They're not using it. So that's why we created some of these activities here to get them to use the language as much as possible during confinement. Excuse me.
Chantal, there are a couple other questions. We can do one of 2 things. I can follow up with you after with these questions. We can make sure that people get the answers to these questions. We could take one on.
We can take one, that's fine.
Okay. A question about secondary there in the chat.
Okay.
About,
okay. All right, so what do we do if we suspect a developmental language disorder at the college level in a country that has very little adaptations? Well, there are very simple things that we can do. Excuse me, I'm losing my. So one thing to keep in mind, to learn a new word, we need to hear that word about 12 times. A child with a developmental language disorder needs to hear it 36 times, so 3 times more often. So just by ensuring that more repetition, to give more visual cues, as well as the auditory cue to explain. So I recommend you listen to that podcast that I talked about, because she gives a lot of strategies, so the ABCs, to make sure that they have that basic knowledge and to make sure that they understand. So there's a lot of strategies there, just sometimes by pre-teaching a little bit about the context, that will help them understand the lesson.
So I noticed that during the pandemic with my daughter, and I have that in the slides. I have a lot of examples from materials that were provided by the teachers. So they're teaching history, but the vocabulary is so complicated that my daughter wasn't grasping the history lesson because she was getting stuck on all of the vocabulary words. So sometimes just giving a little pre-lesson, and these were level 3 words, right? They were very specific. It was about like the 16th century. And so they were very specific to that period. And so had she had a little bit more background knowledge, she would have understood. So even if there isn't specialists or speech language pathologists or accessibility options out there, I think by giving them strategies to ask for clarifications, there's a lot that can be done. But I'd be happy to talk more at length with you on this if you wanted to send me an email.
Yeah, there's so much more we could follow up on. I think we should pause there. I made a note of one other question that I received. I hope that this is the beginning of kind of a relationship with you and with MLF, because I think that your research really supports what most of our schools are all about. So thank you so much for your time, your presentation, your expertise, and everyone, thank you for joining us. And thank you for your attention and your questions. We'll follow up with the slides, and maybe with some, if people have additional questions, we can get those to you. And also with the recording on the MLF YouTube channel.